This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India-United Arab Emirates Virtual Summit and the road ahead. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
In a significant meeting, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, hold a virtual summit this evening on Friday, February 18th. During this summit, both leaders are expected to outline their vision for the future of friendly relations between the two countries, especially at a time when India is celebrating 75 years of its independence and the UAE is celebrating the 50th anniversary of its foundation. India's relationship with the United Arab Emirates have really seen a deepening and a transformation over the past few years and has now become one that spans numerous strategic areas. In fact, the UAE is also meant to be part of a Western Quad grouping being talked about between India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Israel, indicating just how important this bilateral relationship has become. A major initiative in this set of bilateral relations is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Anil, what makes this Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement so important in bilateral relations?
Nilova, as far as this bilateral comprehensive economic partnership agreement is concerned, it's taken some time. It's been in the making for a while. Since 2014, both sides have been trying to reach this agreement. But really speaking, I think there's been an impetus which has been given since September of last year. And at that point in time, India decided to have limited FTAs with a number of countries. UAE was on top of the list, obviously because UAE is a very important bilateral partner. And of course, both countries have had this relationship for a very long time, but really it was in the 90s when the economic liberalization process started in India that trade and investments between the two countries started picking up. Now, if you look at the major exports that India has to the UAE, that's quite a basket. It includes petroleum products, precious metals and stones, gems and jewelry, minerals, food items, fruits and vegetables, tea, meat, seafood, textiles, engineering and machinery products and chemicals. And the mix of the import is also very important because India gets a lot of petroleum and petroleum products, in natural gas and precious metals and stones and wood products from the UAE. If you look at this mix, I think through this agreement, you will have about 80% of India's exports being reduced to zero tariff. And that is really something which will power Indian exports then into UAE and also into areas like Africa and into Europe because UAE is an important trading destination. So from that perspective, I think this is going to be quite a significant bilateral agreement. Of course, this is only the interim agreement and this will also pave the way for a comprehensive agreement in the future.
Our ambassador to the UAE, Sanjay Sudhir, in an interview said that this is a path-breaking pact which will unleash the economic potential between India and the UAE, and it is likely to boost trade between the two countries from $60 billion to about $100 billion over the next 5 years, and also increase trade in services and mutual investments, thus making the UAE probably India's third largest trading partner. So it is clearly very significant. So what actually has powered this particular relationship? I know you were mentioning some of the issues that are traded, but what is so specific and important that the CEPA needed to be signed?
The fact that India-UAE trade was at one point in 2019 $60 billion US. If you look at the current situation in the first 9 or 10 months of this financial year, trade has already crossed about $68 billion US. So it's not insurmountable that this trade will touch $100 billion as our ambassador to UAE has pointed out. But what is most important is that in 5 years' time, the services exports to the UAE is supposed to touch $15 billion. And that's really significant. But along with trade and investment, you also have accompanying interests which will be revived in both countries as far as new sectors are concerned. If you look at what's happened between 2020 and 21, UAE sovereign wealth funds have invested $4.1 billion in India. And these are in 5 very important sectors: the services sector, the sea transport, power, construction activities and construction development for townships and housing and built up infrastructure. All these are important areas for India's development going forward. And we must remember that when Prime Minister Modi had visited UAE in 2015, at that point in time, in the joint declaration which was signed, there was a desire which was expressed that UAE investment would aim to reach a target of $75 billion. Of course, not much happened immediately, but we've now started seeing an interest, and that interest includes investment in Jammu and Kashmir as well, after Article 370, which is going to strengthen India's position internationally on Kashmir, so which is also very significant. And I think by way of cooperation between India and UAE, we have two critical areas of food security and healthcare. This cooperation has come about during the COVID period. And along with that, there is this energy relationship which is continued to strengthen. Now we have new areas of startups, of renewable energy, of fintech, etc. And all that will receive a boost because of this CPAR agreement.
In recent years, bilateral relations between India and the UAE have really strengthened in all areas, actually, particularly also in security and counterterrorism ties, and of course in this economic sphere. So what has made this relationship such an important component of Indian foreign policy today?
I think there's been a comprehensive effort on both sides, I would say, but more in terms of how India has reached out to the GCC countries in general. So whether it's ties with UAE or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the other countries in the region, India has made an effort over the past few years to reach out, knowing fully well that the diaspora in these countries constitute a very important segment of their population. The remittances are very important as well. And it also provides an outlet for Indian investments, which are then meant to benefit these companies who are investing there with their dealings with other continents like Africa and Europe, which are named. For example, $85 billion have been invested by Indian companies in the UAE alone. And that is a huge amount. Of course, UAE is also the eighth largest investor in India with $11 billion between March 2021 alone. Now that's again significant amount if you look at the time period in particular. And Indians make up about 38% of UAE's total residents. So that's a significant portion of the population. Indians are there in every field in the UAE. And if you take the GCC as a whole, relationship is also increased in other fields like defense, for instance. And as we speak today, for instance, we have a defense visit from Saudi Arabia, and that is happening at the same time. So overall, I think there is a concerted effort, concerted push by India to improve this relationship with the GCC countries.
In fact, Prime Minister has visited the UAE thrice since he assumed office. And then since the COVID pandemic happened, the UAE is one of the countries with which India had this air bubble arrangement so that people could travel between the two countries while trying to care for each other's health initiatives and trying to see how best be accommodative of each other's concerns.
I'm glad that you pointed out about the air bubble because that has helped Indians to return back to employment and business in the UAE. And after that, we've seen similar air bubbles being established with other countries in the GCC as well. And as a result, India is the top remittance destination from the UAE and actually got 33.6% of the total outflow from the UAE in 2021. So that's a huge figure again.
That has upwards of 3.5 million Indians actually residing in the UAE, which is a huge number of people. And Prime Minister has expressed his appreciation repeatedly for the leadership of the UAE for particularly supporting and looking after the Indian community during this pandemic. You were talking about the health collaboration also between the two countries. How exactly has that aspect worked?
As far as health is concerned, there is initially, if you remember, when the UAE was struggling with the pandemic, at that point in time, there were a number of countries which were helped by India before we actually had to cut down because of the needs of domestic population. But UAE was in the first lot of countries which received health vaccination as well as we also gave a number of PPE suits and masks and gloves to UAE. That was one of the first countries to receive it. And then we had thereafter, we've had a number of pharmaceutical companies which have been supplying essentials to the UAE and other Gulf countries. But UAE has been the chief receiver of these products from India. Also, India sent 3 prominent medical teams to help out with the hospitals in UAE, doctors and nursing staff. That again happened in the initial stages of the pandemic till UAE could find its feet and manage better to cope with the pandemic. So that was a crucial period in which India was of great help to the UAE. Now, talking about the other areas, when we talked about defense and security cooperation, we should remember that also that UAE has helped in the overflights of Rafale aircraft from France to India. And there have been 2 very significant visits by Indian Army Chief and Chief of Air Staff as well in the last 2 years. Then we have India has participated in NAVDEX 2021 exhibitions in Abu Dhabi, Dubai Air Show in 2021. In fact, in the Dubai Expo, which has just happened, India was allotted one of the biggest plots and was given the right to retain the Indian pavilion even after the Expo. In the UN Security Council, both India and UAE have also coordinating positions. In energy cooperation, there is a transformation because UAE has started participating in India's strategic reserves and has also offered Indian companies to develop stakes in 2 oil fields. And then it is the second largest supplier of LNG to India now. So this is a new cooperation. And then, of course, you must also remember that there's a focus on renewables now as far as cooperation between the 2 countries is concerned. Then we have another very important link, which is that under bin Zayed, the UAE is actually now a country which is promoting religious harmony in West Asia. So there's a Hindu temple, the first of its nature in West Asia, that is being built in the UAE. Large plot of land has been devoted for this temple. So the temple would actually serve more as a symbol of harmony and tolerance in the UAE and would be an example, in my view, for the other GCC countries to follow. So all this sends a signals of very warm relationship between India and the UAE. And the trade pact which is going to be signed is, of course, an icing on the cake today.
Trade relationship aside, there is also this very important counter-terrorism element in the relationship that has developed, that has helped India to a very large extent and vice versa in terms of curbing terrorism, that the UAE has played quite a stellar role in cracking down on a lot of the terrorist elements that were initially using Dubai as a hub, but now all of that has undergone a radical change.
Yes, right from 2015 onwards, when Prime Minister Modi had visited UAE, we've seen a sea change in how the UAE is handling the issues of terrorism. And UAE doesn't want its relationship with any country to be affected because of its own tolerance of these practices, which used to exist earlier. And there used to be a number of criminals who used to find, asylum in countries of the GCC like UAE. But after that, we've seen cooperation, in repatriation of a number of wanted criminals to India. We've also seen the intelligence cooperation grow between the 2 countries, exchange of information on economic crime, which has also gone up tremendously. And we have some white-collar individuals who have also flown from India and were actually in the UAE who've been repatriated in recent times. So all this points to a new attitude in the UAE on how to handle the issue of terrorism and counter-terrorism.
Indeed. So it is very clear and very apparent that the India-UAE relationship is one of the pivotal ones as far as both countries are concerned. Anil, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Nilova.
You were listening to a discussion on India-United Arab Emirates Virtual Summit and the Road Ahead. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can also listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.